All right. Good morning, everybody. It is once again Friday, which means it is once again time for Kingdom on the Road. Man, I am excited because this week my hands are off the steering wheel. Ant's behind the driver's seat this week, and y'all, I think this is going to be interesting. This is one of those weeks where man, I'll say it straight from the gate. That gimmick in the bottom left hand corner to chime in below, that's going to be real. That's going to be real important this week. I mean, it's real important every week, but it's going to be real important this week because this week we are pulling the lens back and we are taking a wide angle perspective over the first 11 chapters of Genesis. We are going to, you know, kind of look at the big picture and then check it out along the way to see like, hey, well, what about this? What about that? And we may double back and hit specifics once we've hit this big picture. And so I kind of want to set the table why the first 11 chapters, right? To some who might not necessarily be well versed, that might seem like an arbitrary number to grab for. And here's the thing, I will stand by the fact that one of the most helpful, potentially scary, depending on your perspective and where your head's at, and a lot of different moving pieces and all of that kind of stuff. But really, one of the most helpful things that you can have in your tool belt from a secular point of view is an understanding of mythology and an understanding that so many different people groups, religions, so many different groups have these stories that are passed down from generation to generation that basically explain their origin, the origin of their region, or the origin of those people, or something along those lines. And in these first 11 chapters, you have some of the high notes of the origin, excuse me, the origin of the universe, the origin of people. That's why this is called, and shout out to Andrew who couldn't make it this week, because he's kind of the one that, credit where credit's due. Brother Matthew helped with this as well. The mythos of mankind, because as you unpack this section, you realize mythos, story. That's all mythos means, is story. This is the story of mankind, the origins of mankind, and this first section of our story with God. And so, one of the interesting notes to make in comprehending all of this, because we're feet firmly rooted in the Old Testament. The whole idea here, our thesis statement from the beginning of this thing, was to demystify the Old Testament, to help give you guys some tools for navigating the Old Testament, but be honest and transparent about the fact that right now, this section that we are in, generally, if people are going to get stuck in the Old Testament and not continue in the Old Testament, we are generally in that section. It's either this, or once we get to the chronology of the kings and we start to read about some of the disgusting stuff that Israel does. So this is a week that, in order to really navigate this is one where you have to understand, how does this, we are going to look at not only, okay, so what does chapter and verse say, but also, what do we do with this when other groups, religions, etc., have stories that look similar, but have very specific, very key differences when you compare them apples to apples. So I'm curious. I'm curious. What I want to start with you, Matt,
Okay.
because we've talked about before. It's come up in our group chat that you are that you used to be really into mythologies and different
Yeah.
things like that. So what came first, the chicken or the egg? Meaning, did you were you into studying this stuff from the Christian context first, or was it your interest in other mythologies that kind of bled into your studies as a Christian?
Um, let's see. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't see the thing, so um well, I've pretty much been Christian as long as I remember, or at least in a Christian context. So, super familiar with the biblical text, and grew up hearing all the Old Testament stuff. But also, as soon as I could read, I was reading um Greek myths. I've always been super fascinated by Egyptology. Like, uh, as a 9-year old, we were in the store and there was a National Geographic on whatever, and it had like um, it had the face thing of a pharaoh on it, and I'm like, Mom, I want that. So I mean, I've always been and yeah, so I think the study of the two side by side, and then when I went, started going through some of my deconstruction and reading textual criticisms and literary views and things like that, like it just made sense to me. Because um, being intimately aware with, I've been able to see just the similarities, not only in the stories themselves, but um, in the style of storytelling. And that's that's the biggest connection piece for me, is in the style of storytelling. That's why I'm so firmly in the, hey, this doesn't have to be, you know, literal history camp. Is
Right.
because the way that it is written, the structures, the mirroring that it contains, and the repetition and all of that are literary styles you find in almost all other ancient myth.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't as into mythology at the same time as I was with when I started reading the Bible. I
Mhm.
actually liked Greek mythology and was very much into it. But then when I started reading the Bible, I kind of, dug into the Bible,
Mhm. Mhm.
and I would see the crossovers in more of the historical timeline, that a lot of the mythology was going on at the same time as the
Mhm.
Bible. Even reading in the book of Acts where they actually mention Zeus and Hermes in the
Right.
Bible. Like you're like, whoa, that's in the Bible that
Mhm.
they're mentioning Zeus and Hermes. And so I wasn't as adept at seeing the parallels, things like Gilgamesh, going alongside with, the flood story, the Tower of Babel, Nimrod crossing over, all these different things. I really didn't see that till later on, looking at it and saying, okay, so again, in that sense, which came first? The hey, is the Bible informed by the myth, or are the myths informed by the Bible, or is it, that during this time these events were happening and people were interpreting them from their cultural context,
Right.
and that's why the stories seem to overlap. So
Mhm.
yeah, I've always thought it was interesting, when people would say, "Oh, well, that seems just like this story." Like, let me read that story. And
Yep.
like you were saying, like, well, it's similar, but then there's some very distinct
Yep.
differences
Yep.
that take it in a whole different direction. So yeah.
Right. Um, I can tell you from the perspective of a youth that was really into mythology, one of the most dangerous things that you can do to an inquisitive youth who recognizes that, well, wait a minute, these different people groups, these different regions all have their own narratives. What do you do with that? Is to try and like toss that under the rug, try to pretend like that bell didn't ring, or like those stories don't exist, because then it just looks like you're hiding something. You know what I mean? Like you like what you do you not believe this, or things like that. And so I for me, my background was very much in a um I was into mythology, very skeptical to the Christian perspective. Um and my kind of setting was on, these are very similar, which means there's a likelihood that this is just how this group of people has deemed to explain the creation of the world, just like that group of people had their way, and that group of people, and so on and so forth. Um, it's now that, I so at some point in the stream, I won't read it off now. I'm very tempted to, because we're hitting some of the notes, but I think it'll be better suited later on in the stream when you guys are rolling. Matt, I would strongly suggest, since you also have access to what Andrew wrote in our group chat, to let him speak at some point in
Yeah.
today's stream, because his words are very summarized very well to a lot of these thoughts. But yeah, I think that I try to think back, and I'm not sure that there was a time where that I can remember where, if the Christian perspective was in my purview, so were these other this understanding that other groups also had their ways of explaining things and all of that. And I wrestled with that for a long time, because I grew up in a context that and this is its own conversation, but this is one touch point that is like, okay, this is applicable here. I don't want to spin off into a full on conversation about it, but it's applicable here. The whole idea of inerrancy, and all of that kind of stuff. And a lot of those conversations that, like, because when you talk about that, you start to talk about things like literal interpretations, and is the Bible a history book, and these are questions that we have been very vocal about the entire time that we've been covering the Old Testament, will continue to be so. But when you are raised in a context where no, God created the world in 7 days, and you know what I mean, that does not leave a lot of room for intellectual conjecture about what does this look like when you understand the structure and style of telling a story. And the fact that mythos doesn't mean fake, it means story, and allows for a deeper approach to the text, to say, okay, what's the purpose? What's the intention? What is trying to be conveyed here? And all of those kinds of things. and yes, there are aspects within 11 and that when you get to, you're like, okay, this would seem like this is more based in actual history, whereas this we don't know, as though that this is like what it actually looked like, more so that what is this trying to tell us about us and our relationship with God and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So when you know, bringing that up, we have covered 1 through 3, and you know, trying to we're still in what I think you would call the uh, pre-Noah pre-Noah area as we go into chapter 4 and chapter 5.
Yep.
A lot of these things, again, I like what you said, Joe. What's the purpose? What is the purpose of these? And let's see if I can put that up there, since I'm driving the bus, I guess. See if I can fit this up on the screen. Is that visible? Do I need to make it bigger somehow? Let's see.
No, it looks good.
Okay. So, yeah, Cain and Abel is where we're at, chapter 4. Um, and so when we get here, there's a lot to we could get stuck here, right?
Yeah.
You know, so where do we want to go from here? Because with Cain and Abel, this is kind of the beginning of, you know, I know Adam and Eve are the beginning of human history, but this is really the beginning, right? This is life after the garden. This
Right.
is, you know, what is man like after sin has entered into the world? They're outside of that place of safety and comfort of the garden, and they're in the real world, and we get to see the effects of sin in this account of these two brothers. And so I'm gonna go with Matt. Like, what are your thoughts on this account of Cain and Abel?
So for Cain and Abel, so Cain and Abel, in my perspective, at least growing up, um, the big debate was always, why was Cain's offering rejected?
Yeah.
I think, like, that's the talking point. If we're gonna pick a thing from each of these to kind of highlight, that would be where I would go with Cain and Abel. Obviously we've got jealousy, we've got the first murder, we've got his blood, crying out to God for revenge, whatever that means, and the mark of Cain, whatever that is. But for me, in my life, what people I've studied with always seem to come back to is the issue over the sacrifice. Because you have your, well, it has to be blood types, where the problem is that it was fruit and veggies. It was a vegan sacrifice. And then you have the other people. Well, it was his heart. He was going through the motions. It wasn't his best stuff.
So
Yeah.
one of the things that I find interesting is how is just the different experiences, right? Like I used to, when I first, oh, I should say not when I first, but I kind of, 1A, I got saved, came out of the prosperity gospel, 1B, 2020. And so um I was angry for a lot of my time as a Christian. That's its own conversation. But so I haven't always been interested in the differences that make up different Christians, and like what stands out. But now that I've like come around and I'm like, oh, okay, so like this is what it means to cooperate in the sandbox. Um, it fascinates me how different, like what stands out to different groups, Christians, things like that. And there's a million different influences and reasons behind it. But in my experience, which isn't, I'm not a lifer by any stretch of the imagination. It's not about the sacrifice specifically. Like, why was his sacrifice rejected? Partially because literally the only way that I've ever heard it taught. I've never, until I started hanging around with you guys, I never heard anything about like what the actual sacrifice was, more that it wasn't his best. So maybe that's part of it. Maybe I hadn't heard an alternative thought process as far as that goes. But to me personally, in reconciling it, it just seems like the bigger picture is so this is rejected. So like that's more of a statement than a why question. It's more of just a statement of fact.
Mhm.
But the question becomes, how does Cain respond to that? How does God respond to Cain? All of those kinds of things, like those seem to be the bigger pictures at play, for, just so you know, and the thing, the things off the screen.
Yeah, I just took it off.
Okay. Sorry, my screen went to sleep, and then when it came back up, the thing was gone.
Oh,
So, but so that to me seems like that's more of like the thing as far as Cain and Abel goes, and that for me kind of lends to this bigger picture narrative of looking at it from the perspective of what does that say about us, our relationship with God, all of that kind of stuff.
yeah. I would agree with you guys. I've kind of went through all those processes too, where the sacrifice. Why was it rejected? That was a
Right.
huge conversation. Cain himself. What was the difference between him and Abel? And I think again, after reading, and you guys, after reading the Bible in its
Yep.
totality, reading it through, reading it back through, studying through, breaking certain things down, you see that the Genesis account, all of it has either we can either call it prophetic or foreshadowing, or even typology that leads to some type of discussion with the New Testament, salvation, Jesus, even Abel's sacrifice. That's begin to hear that, okay, because I think somebody said blood, it had to be blood, right? Well, that camp is probably saying that because Jesus was going to be the sacrifice, right? He was going to be the lamb that was slain and the sacrifice. So it's this picture. And so is Cain's offering rejected just because it's not that? Is it is fruits and vegetables just not, good enough because this is actually, foreshadowing this picture of Christ, and then you have, Israel divided, brother against brother, the Israelites, fighting against each other. And then you can get really out there, right? With Cain and Abel being the flesh and the spirit, right? One being, serving God and, following God. Because I think it's in John where First John actually uses the analogy of Cain and Abel, and Cain being, the world, and Abel representing, those that are following Christ. And so it's interesting that this passage has so many directions that it can go in, just from their story. And like you said, the mark of Cain, well, that has a mythos of its own.
Right.
Yeah. That has been taken and done a lot of amazing things with that, that have nothing to
And
do with what
and
the
not so good
Bible.
things.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Those that are watching, please chime in and let us know where you're chiming in from, and if you have questions, make sure that you jump on, because we love talking to each other, but we like talking to you guys as well.
Yep.
Amen. I forgot I have to put that back up there, huh?
Yeah.
I'm driving the bus, y'all. I'm driving.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting to get into. I think a lot of these things you're going to see a theme, and this is kind of where I'm going to leave my thoughts and then dip out. I think each one of these things, right? Ant's got up on the screen here. Each one of the kind of the major themes of the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and this kind of takes us from creation to the Tower of Babel. And I think every single one of these has major and minors. There are things that you can stop and camp, and is it this or is it that, or does this mean this or does this mean that? But I think at the same token, it's also very easy to see in each one of these, this is another piece of the puzzle of developing a larger picture perspective of what God does with creating the world, creating man rejecting him, and continuing to show grace and love and mercy and all of those kinds of things, which is an interesting concept when you get to something like the flood, because that in and of itself can have its own thing. Because guys, I'm going to throw this controversial thing out there. Out of all of these things, right, I think you kind of have to have a historic Adam and Eve. I've come to the perspective that I think you even have to have a historic Cain and Abel. I think there's enough references to it that you need to have a historic Cain and Abel. I've not been completely convinced and sold out that the flood actually took place the way that the Bible illustrates it, in the very literal sense that everybody says that it did. I'm also not willing to die on that hill. I could be wrong. I 100%. I'm not staking my flag in the ground. I'm saying I remain skeptical.
Something happened. There's too many different flood myths.
Yeah, I agree. I agree that something happened.
Right.
Whether or not that something is a worldwide flood in the very literal sense, again, I remain skeptical. But I say all of that to say, I think regardless of whether or not it was a worldwide flood, or if it was just a geographic location and there was poetic language used, or if there, regardless, you can look at every single one of these and look at the larger picture perspective of, again, what does this say about God and his interaction with us and all of those kinds of things.
Yes.
And so I say to everybody watching, I leave you with this piece of advice. You guys are in two incredibly intellectual, strong hands of walking through these things, but seriously, yes, listen, but also ask questions. Poke and prod. Be unafraid to test the boundaries of all of these things, because Lord knows. And in this case, I don't just mean that as a turn of phrase. Lord knows that if you're asking that question, somebody else, either on this stream or elsewhere, has probably already asked that question. And God hasn't kicked him out for it. So, yeah, this stuff can be intimidating, because you're well, what if this, if this, guys, if it didn't happen like this, and what does this say about the rest of the Bible, guys? If again, I promise you, if you're asking those doubtful questions, somebody on the stream has probably already asked those doubtful questions.
Yeah.
But understand that that's why we go through these things, is to unpack and to create an environment that is safe to be able to explore the parameters. So I'm going to catch the playback, and I will be very interested to see how far you guys get, what interaction there is, all of that kind of stuff. And what many rabbit holes you guys find to jump headfirst into. So before I go, I got to do my shtick. Remember two very important things: that you are prayed for and you are loved deeply. Have a good rest of the show, guys.
Thanks, man.
See you, man.
All right, folks. As he signs off, again, if you're out there, come on, let's chime in. I know there's a few people hanging out. Go ahead and chime in. Good morning to you. Jump into the conversation, because me and Mac, we can wax poetic
go with this.
Right? But if you guys have questions, please jump on with your questions. I am monitoring the chat, and so jump in. So Cain and Abel. A lot of times and I've kind of mentioned this, and now I guess we can kind of go into it a little bit. Cain kills Abel, which is the first murder, right? And this is a direct result of humanity having fallen. Sin is entered into the world, and this happens.
Sin is crouching at your door,
but you'll rule over it. Why didn't Cain rule over it? Why did he, and these are all questions I don't think we can answer, because I don't think the Bible says explicitly, but Cain kills his brother. Why was that his solution?
For his jealousy.
Yeah, jealous of his brother. But that goes back to the whole sacrifice thing. There's something in the sacrifice. If that was Cain's job, right? He was a tiller of the ground. That's what it says, right? Yeah. And Abel, was kind of a shepherd, and so he gave from what he had. Cain gives from what he has. Again, it's really hard to discern what really definitively makes Cain's sacrifice not respected or unacceptable to God. Right. And so, folks that are watching, what are your thoughts? What makes Cain's sacrifice unacceptable to God from your perspective? What have you learned? What have you been taught? And we'll talk about it a little bit, because the Cain and Abel, again, like I said, this typology, this story shows up throughout the rest of the Bible.
Yep.
And so, So Matt, what do you think? Let's dive into it a little bit.
Well, so I was in the blood sacrifice camp for a long time, and now I'm just not sure one way or the other, just because. So we see God slay an animal to make skin coverings for Adam and Eve to cover their sin. So if God's first sacrifice, shall we say, for the covering of sin was a blood sacrifice, some would say that's the tradition. Cain could have very well gone to his brother and said, may, may I have a goat? May I have a lamb?
Right.
For this is our tradition. But instead, he brought fruits because he didn't, care enough about the all of it to do it the right way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
yeah.
that's a take.
Yeah. And then there's the take of, and I think this is something that, we see playing out because he kills his brother, is that sin was crouching at the door, that his heart was the problem. His motivation, was something more. The Bible says that man looks at the outward appearance, right? But God looks at the heart. And so God's rejection of his sacrifice for some individuals is, well, God knew what was in his heart. Cain's heart was pure towards the Lord. There was no, deceit in him. He was doing what he knew to do. But Abel was doing what he needed to do. But Cain, there was something going on there, almost like a Ananias and Sapphira type deal, where you could have done this, but you chose to kind of be a little deceitful in what you're doing, and that is one of the reasons why it was rejected. Because when he goes on to say, he says, hey, if you do what's right, you will be accepted, you will be respected, but sin is crouching at the door and you will rule over it. But like you say, Cain, being jealous of his brother, rose up and slew his brother.
Yep.
And then and his blood cried out from the ground.
Right.
His blood crying out from the ground, that whole deal. So I think Cain and Abel, again, in my thought process, have a lot of foreshadowing that lead to a lot of different concepts that are played out through the rest of the Bible.
Right. And yet, God protects Cain.
Right. He's still merciful.
Right. The mark actually protects Cain.
Right.
It's not this curse.
Yeah.
It's a seal of protection for you will wander about not finding a home, but I will put this mark on you. So and anyone who kills Cain was 7 times over. All that language in there. So
which
it's a curse, but it's also like protection.
Yeah. Which shows, again, same thing in the garden. They're put out of the garden, but he kills an animal, covers them. So there's, even in judgment, somehow there's still mercy. There's still compassion. And it's like, but I think this is overlooked in God's character because we focus in on, he kicked him out of the garden. He cursed Cain, and then if you go into a lot of the popular ideas, the mark of Cain is a whole lot of stuff. It leads to a lot of the offshoots from the Bible, those that read Apocrypha or pseudepigrapha, different, ideas are birthed from that, even just from Jewish mythology, right? The Jewish mythology, they build an entire, offshoot of the mark of Cain. Those that are watching, hopefully you guys can chime in. I don't know if I have this on or off. Yeah, okay. So yeah, you guys can chime in, let us know your thoughts on Cain and Abel. Otherwise, we're getting ready to move forward a little bit to Adam's descendants, to Noah, which is the that huge genealogy where there are some very popular names on that list. What are some of the folks that stand out in this list for you, Matt?
Was that Genesis
Yeah,
5?
5. Yeah. I wonder if there's a way.
Well, so this is where we get Lamech.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wives of Lamech, hear me. For I have killed a man.
Yeah. Lamech.
Lamech, Enoch. It
Enoch.
comes from this lineup, and then obviously we've got Methuselah,
Methuselah.
who whose name interestingly enough means his death shall bring judgment. And I've done the math, and at least as far as the narrative goes, he lived until the flood. So, his namesake was true.
Right. I'm gonna see if I can pull some stuff here that we can put up here. Yeah. Trying to drive this bus.
Come on.
All
There
right.
you go.
Let's see. Did it download? Let's see.
Well, then this is where Seth gets introduced as well. So the the line of God, as some call it.
Right.
So, and then other sons and daughters.
Right. Says it's there, but I don't see it. Okay. All right. We won't mess with that too much. But yeah, you
so
have.
we get Seth. This is where the Sethites. And that's a whole theology too. In some Jewish sects, and in some of that stuff is what happened to the Sethites.
Yeah. Because even they play into Genesis 6. I don't want to jump too far ahead into that. But and like you said, Methuselah.
That's a theory. The Sethites are.
Yeah, we may touch on that. Again, you guys can chime in. If there's questions that you have or things that you want to offer in, and so this genealogy with Adam down all the way to Noah has a lot of twists and turns. You have some ages in there that are interesting. Even Adam and Eve, I remember teaching on this. They have the longest marriage on record. No one was married longer than them, right? And then you have Methuselah, who lived
969 years.
69 years on there, and his offspring Enoch, and then it was Enoch, and there was Enosh.
So you've got Seth, who was the father of Enosh, and Enosh was the father of Kenan. Kenan was the father of Mahalalel, who was the father of Jared, and Jared was the father of Enoch, and Enoch the father of Methuselah.
Yeah.
And let's see. And then Lamech. Where is Noah's? Yeah. And so Lamech was Noah's dad. going through. So Methuselah would have been Noah's grandpa.
Right. Right.
And then Noah was 500 years old when Genesis 6 starts. Now, did they actually live this long? Are these symbolic numbers that mean things and their meanings that have been lost over time because we don't really do numerology in that way anymore? Who knows? Because I know in the Septuagint, these ages are different. Right. So then we have to look, so that's another inerrancy conversation. And what a phrase I read a little bit ago that really made all this click for me is like something can be truthful but not accurate.
Interesting.
Because I can give you directions to my house that are truthful directions. They
Right.
get you here, but maybe I'm wrong about a gas station. Maybe it's on the left instead of on the right side.
Yes.
Those sorts of things. So I gave you truthful directions,
Right.
but I wasn't accurate.
Yeah. I kind of ran into that this week. And this is something that is a whole nother conversation. I don't know if we can get into because it'll sidetrack us, but the Masoretic text versus the Septuagint, right?
Mm-hmm.
The variations, right? And both, like you said, truthful, but there's details along the way getting to things that you're like, well, whoa, why does this say 22 instead of 42 or 10 instead of 20 or 30, 600 pounds here and it's only 30 pounds here, but it's still within the same context of the story. It's still, but there's a detail discrepancy there where a person can get hung up on that and say, well, can I trust any of it because of that discrepancy?
Right.
Even though, like you said, I gave you the directions and you did get to the address.
Mm-hmm.
But the gas station I said was on the left was actually on the right.
Right. Yeah. Exactly right. So, well, and then with the Septuagint too, there's the I don't know if it's an external debate that I've heard or if these are just my questions, but is it a faithful translation from the Hebrew to the Greek, or is it translated and updated through the theology of the 70s?
Right. Did they use some of their ideology to then the Masoretic is Jews translating this almost from memory. Yeah. like wow, how did you do that? So yeah, let's move forward. Like I said, we'll see how far we can get. The increasing corruption on the earth.
Oh boy, so, Genesis 6.
Yeah, so we're building to Genesis 6. The increasing corruption is on the earth. This is where the discussion of we talked about the Sethites.
Yeah.
So give you a chance to get into that a little bit. When it comes to the sons of God and the daughters of men, a couple of different theories about
one little verse.
Yeah. And so the increasing corruption, that brings us into Genesis 6.
Yeah.
And the famous sons of God saw the daughters of men, saw that they were fair, and they married them. And then the interesting debate whether this union produced Nephilim or there were Nephilim already there.
Right, because
You know,
it's kind of fragmented.
yeah,
Man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any that they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, and his days shall be 120 years.
mm-hmm.
Okay, what?
Yeah,
The sons of the sons of God sleep with the daughters of men, and God's like, nope, I'm not gonna be with man forever.
right,
So that's something. That's
right,
some kind of thing.
right, something.
And then the Nephilim were on the days in those or were on the earth in those days and after.
Right, and after, right. I've gotten into that discussion with people, and I said, well, just reading the text, it appears that there were already Nephilim, or giants is what the word is.
Yep.
Nephilim is the Hebrew word that it almost makes it mystical and epic to say Nephilim, but really there were giants on the earth in those days, and then after when the sons of God, right?
Right, but that is one whole verse. Obviously, there's no
right.
verse
Yeah, you got to
numbers in
read
the
it.
original.
You got to read it all together, right?
But it's the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So, is this your Hercules and your, these
Right,
other mythological characters?
right,
I've always read it that way, just because, as I said, I was kind of always reading mythology alongside with. So who knows?
right.
Who are these men of renown?
Who were they? Yeah, I mean, because that same language is going to show up later on when we get to chapter 10 with Nimrod, a
Yep.
mighty warrior before the Lord, a man of renown, right?
Yeah.
Like, okay, so was he part of this? Because when you begin to separate, the flood, like, why are there giants that survive and on the other side of the flood?
Yeah.
If they were produced by this particular union, why didn't God destroy that unless they were there and there was something that happened afterwards? It's like they were a part of humankind in a way, not just produced by this union. And I think that's where people struggle, especially when you introduce extra biblical sources, right?
Sure.
You start introducing the extra biblical sources, and now, like, well, no, that's what this is. And now we go into a whole stream of thought from this union that produces, books like Enoch, books like the history of Adam and Eve, where there's Jasher. There's other books that kind of break out of this to fill in the gaps, so to speak, and explain what or argue for, is, from what my understanding is argue for this particular thinking, and so, but like you said, just reading the text in its total, just reading it as a whole, there's a flow here that this increasing evil is in a world that has giants. It is renowned warriors, and it has wickedness like never seen before.
Yeah. Every intention of the thoughts of man was only evil continually.
Only evil continually.
Yeah. So only evil all the time.
All the time.
That's it.
Wow. And God,
How much time?
Yeah.
All the time.
All the time. And God, or Adonai, regretted that he had made humankind on the earth. It grieved his heart. And he said, I'll wipe out humankind, whom I have created, from the whole of the earth, and not only human beings, but animals, creeping things, birds in the air, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the sight of the Lord, or Adonai. I'm reading out of my Jewish Complete. Anytime I read the Old Testament, I like to grab the Jewish Complete, just to, like you were talking about with the Tanakh, grabbing that Tanakh and reading from the Tanakh.
So is that a Masoretic, or is it a Septuagint, or how do they do that?
I think this is a Masoretic. Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Well, look who's back, guys.
What's up? Yeah, I decided to take the on the road part literally. I won't be able to stay for the rest of the show, but I figure I can be on for a few.
Nice.
So we're
kind of
on
the road.
Yeah,
on the road.
On the road.
So we're kind of in Genesis 6, the increasing corruption on the earth, and going through the different theories of the sons of God, the daughters of men, and
haven't touched it yet, but we're right there.
So I picked exactly the right time to jump back in. Cool.
Yeah. So I mean, there's the Sethite explanation, which we hinted at earlier with the genealogy. Like, I'm not sure why that would cause a thing, but that's a theory.
Well, with the Sethite theory, I think it's safer for people to view this as human beings.
It's less scary.
Yeah. And so it's safer. I'm like, no, this wasn't angels or anything like that. This was, the mixing of the good guys, the guys that were, loved by God, who began to call on the name of the Lord, right? They entered into this union with the daughters of men, right? And so that seems a lot safer than the alternative,
But it doesn't make any sense.
Right. It's a
this
struggle.
Group of people got with this group of people.
Right.
And suddenly God's like, you know what? I can't anymore.
Right.
I gotta wipe them all out.
I can't with this anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And so and there are people that argue they'll die on that hill.
Right.
They'll die on that hill that no, there's no way that God would allow, angelic beings until you do, like you said, you do the research and the word study. And the sons of God here, are not just the Sethites.
Yeah.
Well, that was the explanation. I guess I would call it the response to the History Channel of it all, because I'm from the generation where History Channel after 9 p.m. was wild and out. There was some wild stuff on the History Channel after 9 o'clock. And that a lot of the response to the whole was this angelic interaction, was it that was to say,
was it aliens?
Okay, so was it aliens? So was to say okay, so son of is simply a title that we see of several different places throughout the Bible. So that this must just mean this is a people group that were going by this title, and thus just kind of going the very I'll call it pedestrian route of this is just referring to a very specific group of people. Right. I think in the large in the large picture of it all, that doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. Even
Right.
before you get to the word study portion of it,
Right.
just flat out and out, like in its context, to say that it's just referring to, when it says sons of, that it's referring to a title, doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. But this is one of those areas that, like I said before, asking questions and poking and prodding, I don't think is necessarily a dangerous proposition,
Right.
because it's not clearly stated, it's not clearly outlined.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and it. So yeah, there's the Sethite theory, which I think we've all pretty much agreed upon doesn't really make much sense. There's the angelic being, or like other god, Enochian theology, the Second Temple version, or this is also where a lot of like the ancient aliens people like
Yep.
like to try and find their on road into the Bible and say, okay, well, um, you know these were other sons of God from other places.
Yeah. 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 And I think when you're
There's
digging,
aliens in your Bible, y'all.
yeah, and there are people that will stake their claim on that. That in the beginning, let us. That was God in the aliens. Creating.
Right. Right.
Mankind.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is where enters the whole idea of this corruptness in the world reaching its apex and
Yeah.
needing to be dealt with in a severe way. And so people argue. I saw somebody really slam the fact that God regretted making man here.
Mhm.
And so that becomes another point of struggle for people. So when you guys have you guys run into that, well, how are you gonna trust the Bible where your own God regretted making you? you know he repented even making man, right? And like you said, before getting into any word study or anything, just on the surface, that seems like a place of contention where it got so bad that he didn't want you anymore. How is that God loving, in that
Right.
sense?
Yeah, I'm trying to
In
do
my
the
flesh, I
word.
want to look at something like that and be like, can you really blame him for regretting creating mankind? Have you looked at the world? Just being
Right.
honest.
Right. Yeah.
I'm interested to hear from the lifer perspective from you two, because I that's not an argument that I've necessarily heard a lot of all of that, because um, generally um, generally in my circles, the people that I work with or minister to or something like that have a very present understanding of the depths of how much people can suck.
Mm,
And
right.
so this isn't something that necessarily sticks out like a red flag to them. You know what I mean?
Right. Right. Matt,
Okay.
anything on that, or is that not a big deal for you either?
Well, I'm just pulling up the Strongs here because that was my curiosity, is like,
Right.
what is actually that word there? And then so
Yeah.
do uh, uh, doing that too. Obviously, you get to see the reading of the good old King Jimmy, and you know, and God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man, and it grieved him at his heart. And that it's Nakam, which is a root word that is to sigh or breathe strongly.
Right.
It implies sorrow. So, this is another one of those situations where there's this Hebrew word, and the translators don't really know exactly what to do with. So,
Right.
and God sighed.
Right.
No. Well, that's not a very good story. God
Right.
repented.
He regretted, right?
Yeah.
You know, yeah, because you're absolutely right. This sigh that it's just like, you buggers. No. You know, you think about that. God then decides that we're going to remedy this. And
right.
I mean, when you think about that every thought of man was continually wicked.
Right. Only evil all the time in some translations.
You know, that's an interesting deal.
Right. We think things are bad now.
Right. Right. So,
that could lead to its own conversation about, you know, and this is where my
Yeah.
cynicism is going to show, but this could very easily lead to a deeper conversation of, is this what it looks like when man is truly like, this is a snapshot into man without the influence of God, like having rejected God completely, and this is a pre-Jesus world.
Mm-hmm.
And does this speak to, again, we go back to that whole foreshadowing thing, right?
Right.
We go back to
Yep.
how does all of this fit into the larger picture narrative? Well, you look at things like how people are when they're left. You know, look at, so the age old shopping cart test, right? It's a, for those of you that don't know, that is a philosophical practice and a morality practice of what do you do with the shopping cart, because there's nobody sitting there with that's policing that. There's literally no net benefit to you to put the shopping cart back in the corral after you're done. And that's why you go to stores and you see shopping carts all over the place, because there's no net benefit on the individual to put it back. And yeah, I think for me, I read something like this, and this is where, before I stepped away the last time, I had said each one of these things can have rabbit holes and it can have big picture. I think big picture is that when you look at people, this is a look into humanity and humankind, and this is a look into I made the joke about how much people can suck, but yeah, I'm glad that you brought in the Strungs, because that's really all it is. It's essentially just a sigh, but it shows the fact that God isn't going to, throw out the clay and restart and this and that, and you know what I mean? Like, I do think that we need to be aware of what this says about humanity and what humanity is capable of left to their own devices. That's why I don't get deep into the weeds on morality and is morality a thing and what is morality and all of that kind of stuff, because you can pretty well sum it up to morality is subjective and people suck. You know what I mean?
Right. But also this can speak to the influence and the presence of the spirit in the world. Because here we are in Genesis 6, where men are only evil all the time.
Mm.
So, this is pre-Jesus. This is pre the falling of the Holy Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
This is men left to their own devices
Devices.
without
Yeah.
the help of God.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, yes, our world is going to hell in a handbasket. Maybe there's no handbasket. Maybe we're just, but we also have the influence of the church and the spirit in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a good point to quote quote the great philosopher Tom Petty. We are in fact free falling. Guys, I had to work it in somewhere. I had
man.
you set that up perfectly, Matt. Um, but yeah, I think you're pretty well bang on the banana there of the fact that we see we are looking through the lens of history before Jesus, before Holy Spirit, before this very present influence of God. I think it's an important distinction to make with what you said that I think the only place where it starts to become a pertinent part of the conversation is to say that the influence of the large C church rather than like individual churches, because I think when you get to individual churches, I think that loses its luster big time. Like I just don't think that the influence is nearly as palpable. But again, that might just be cynicism.
So
It should be,
yeah, it should be,
but it isn't.
and so, I was looking forward just a little bit, and I don't know how long we want to hang out here, but the thing that always jumps out at me is Noah was a righteous man, and I've heard people kind of argue Noah's righteousness, but it says that, Noah was a righteous man and wholehearted. Noah walked with God. So in the midst of all this, there's still this individual that walked with God, that still did righteously. Does this mean that he was perfect? Probably not. So, I
Well,
wonder.
no, but we see what happens afterwards.
I wonder, so what makes Noah righteous? Again, it almost feels like the conversation about Cain's unrighteousness, Noah's righteousness, because I don't see anything that he did that made him righteous. So why is he considered righteous here?
I mean, there's a certain we don't know. He says he walked with God.
And that may be it, right?
That may be it. That may be it. He may have been the one in a million that was given given God the time and day.
Yeah.
That's the impression that I get when you look at Noah in comparison to the rest of humanity. It would seem as if depending on how exactly you take the what's written there, that it's just a matter of somebody who is even attempting. You know what I mean? In comparison to what seems to be largely something that isn't present in the lives of others.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because, again, Jesus brings this up, right? He says, in the days, so as it was in the days of Noah, that like you said, we think it's bad, but the days of Noah were as bad as it could get.
Right. But then we've got Enoch, who was his great grandfather,
Right.
and who walked with God to the point that God just took him out of the
Right.
world, saved him from death.
He was no more. Yeah.
Yeah. He just walked with God and he wasn't. What's that? How do I sign up for that?
And it again is that foreshadowing that walking with God produces this salvation, right? Enoch's he was taken, right? Noah, he was given a way out. But either way, them walking with God produce this safety with God, which, when you look forward, and again, this is just, I want to stay present in the text. I hate the fact that I can't help myself but to look forward, to how the New Testament portrays this.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's the way it's written.
Yeah.
Obviously, they didn't know that at the time, but we, because we have the completed work.
Yeah.
We know the whole story. We can see, that's how these stories are written. They absolutely point forward.
And it's almost like if you were to just read the Old Testament by itself with no knowledge of the New Testament, you are missing it. You are, and so someone says, well, I'm reading through the Old Testament. Great. How do you help them to make sure that as they're reading through and they're grasping what's happening there, that there is a larger picture, that you only have part of the story, you only have part of the revelation reading this, after, me and you alike, after many years of reading through the Bible, New Testament, Old Testament, New Testament, Old Testament, the hyperlinks are firmly in place. You hit one thing, you're like, whoop, that takes me right to here every time, and vice versa. I'm reading in the New Testament, boom, that takes me right back to here, and so even reading through these first 11 chapters, there's so many first mentions here.
Yeah.
There's so many first mentions here. There we go. There's so many first mentions here that it's amazing. And so every time I look at something, it's like, oh, this is pointing towards something. It's not just resting in its own story. It is a typology. It is a foreshadow, however you want to say it, a prophetic, however you want to say it. And Noah and this time on the earth is something that for us who look at eschatology, we're coming back towards this type of season in our world, in our history. So, all right.
And here's another interesting tidbit, almost like a Genesis 1, Genesis 2 deal. You've got the first chunk of Genesis 6 here, which we just looked at, that gives one account of man's wickedness. And then we get to the introduction of Noah, where it says, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God, and he had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence.
Right.
But haven't we already been told that?
Nope, because this thing is going. It's still going, right? It's still going. It's still pushing forward, right?
Yeah.
Earth is filled with violence. God saw the earth, and yes, it was corrupt. For all living things. So all living beings, had corrupted their ways on the earth. So all living beings. So earlier it mentioned that even the animals at this point. I was actually sharing that with somebody yesterday. you know, the fact that animals attack humans or kill, and all these things are a part of this corruption that is linked to the fall. That imagine being in that garden before sin and being able to walk up to, you know, a 10-foot bear and you don't have to be scared, you know. But once sin enters, now it's volatile. Anything can kill you, right? Because it's filled with violence, right? You know, the way we see the world now, it's like, wow, yeah, these are dangerous. But in the garden, it wasn't dangerous.
Right.
Yeah.
And really, so we get into the flood. God tells Noah, hey, you're all right. I'm going to save you. Build an ark.
Right. Right. Again, whatever that is, right?
Yeah. I mean, obviously something happened. We've got Gilgamesh. We've got so many other. You know, there's a great deluge myth in Egyptian mythology.
Yep.
Um,
Asian, you know,
yeah,
all across, you know,
yeah,
there
yeah.
is an event.
A lot of indigenous tribes have a flood myth as well.
And so, like Joe was saying, he's not sure about a worldwide flood, right?
Right.
But there was something catastrophic that touched multiple cultures.
Yeah.
And they all have a reflection. They all have a historical account or some type of story, even if it's, you know, we say it's not historical. They have some type of story that links that this happened on the earth in a large catastrophic proportion.
Yeah, for sure.
Mayans, like you said, everybody has.
Oh yeah. Yep.
You know, and so people argue the flood as, I don't buy that.
Something happened.
But something significant, catastrophic happened.
Yeah, for sure.
That even changed the landscape, you know, of the way the world looks. What's up, Pastor TC? Thanks for joining us. And so the flood idea is I think is huge, and it's a point of contention for a lot of people as well. You know, even within the Christian community, right?
Yeah, for sure. But so God floods the earth. You know, he brings animals to Noah. Seven of the clean ones, so they would have food. Interestingly enough, clean and unclean had not been defined yet.
Yeah.
And yet here we see you know, so that's obvious proof to me that the story was written later.
Yeah, looking back
at so that was an aside. I'm not trying to make any deep, theological point there, but I'm just saying, hey, clean and unclean hadn't been defined yet, and yet we're told that 7 of the clean animals came, and you know,
so and
2 of every other is, you know, according to their kind. God floods the earth. It rains for 40 days and 40 nights, which, you know, 40 is a biblical number.
Yes. A very reoccurring biblical number.
Yeah. What is that? The completeness of time.
Yeah. It's comes up a lot. So even looking at this, you know,
40 years in the desert.
Yeah. 40 years. And Jesus fasted for 40 days.
Yep.
40 nights. Yeah. Yeah. Very significant number that reoccurs. When you look at the flood and you look at the the people and the animals on, on the ark, one of the things that came up a couple of years ago when I was doing a study on the giants in the Bible, the Nephilim, the Raphaim, the Anakim, the Gibberine. Well, anyway, doing a study on the giants, one of the comments that I got was, well, yeah, the giants were on the ark. What are your thoughts on that? Were the giants on the ark?
I mean, we know that Noah and his sons were on the ark. We're not told about any other people.
Right.
But then were the giants considered people?
There you go. So what?
or were they considered, part of part of the beasts and not part of man? Or was there just giant blood in one of because Noah's sons had daughters and we don't know where they came from.
Yes.
So were they of these lines of the sons of men, whoever they were?
Right. Yeah. I mean, because again, when that argument is posed towards me,
I've never thought of that before, but yeah.
They almost posed it to me like dummy, don't you know that they were on the ark? It's like, yeah, I never thought of that, but like you said, looking into it, what if
they're not considered men and they're just part of the beasts, and every beast of the field,
right? If they're not considered men, but flipping, thinking forward into the Bible, when you look at maybe Goliath, right, which he is a descendant of Enoch, which Enoch is a descendant of the Nephilim. You're like, well, how come they look human now?
Right.
They're very large, but they're human now. And so was the giants just a different race of human being? And the DNA for giants, like you said, was in one of those people, because, I was talking to somebody about even giants today. I was like, I wonder what somebody would have thought 5,000 years ago if they saw Shaquille O'Neal. Now, he's not 9 feet tall, but what would they have thought if they were seeing a man as massive and as athletic as that individual,
right?
5,000 years ago.
Yeah.
What would they have thought? They would thought, man, he's got to be from the gods or something.
Yeah, just walks over, just picks them up by their head. No.
So yeah, definitely interesting. And so the flood was for 40 days on the earth. The waters grew higher and higher. The ark floated, so that it was lifted up off the earth. And the waters overflowed the earth and grew deeper until the ark floated to the surface of the waters, and the waters overpowered the earth mightily, and all the high mountains under the entire sky were covered, and the waters covered the mountains by more than 22.5 feet. That's a very specific number. All living beings that moved on the earth perished: birds, livestock, other animals, insects, even human beings, everything in whose nostrils was the breath of the spirit of life. Whatever was on dry land died. He wiped out every living thing on the surface of the ground, not only human beings, but livestock, creeping animals, and birds in the air. They were wiped out from the earth, and only Noah was left, along with those who were with him on the ark. And the waters held power over the earth for 150 days. This water even got the birds. What? Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. And how does it wipe out fish and stuff?
Yeah. Right. This was a different kind of water, right?
Something.
Yeah.
He
It really
he
doesn't
sends
even
out.
it doesn't even mention the fish, does it?
Does it say? Well, it says every. Hold on.
Yeah. It says everything on dry land,
Okay.
livestock, like
Every beast of the earth. Yeah.
surface of the
Okay.
ground. So, and
Maybe
this
not the fish,
and this is where
but it is the birds of the air.
another wild theory comes in. You know,
Okay.
where the Nephilim survived in the water, right?
Okay.
And they produced titans under the water. water. And so,
Fascinating.
yeah. Oh man, it gets wild. And I'm not even touching the surface of how wild it gets, because some of it is like I can't even say that with a straight face, because they get the idea of mermaids and all these. No, really. And I know some of you guys are listening. You
that
probably
comes from, that comes from somewhere.
right. I know some of you guys are listening, like, no, like, yeah, there's been some stuff, that is done with this account.
Yeah,
And
Genesis 6 specifically. There's
yeah,
just so many offshoots. Because what are these Nephilim? Why were they there? Why were they still there after?
right.
Why is it mentioned? And why does that seem to be what was the last straw for God?
Right.
Look, I
Right.
know you guys. Look, I know you guys are always evil all the time, but this Nephilim stuff,
Right.
like that's one step too far.
Right. Yeah, like you said, if that was the case, if that was the tipping point, that okay, now it's totally out of hand now, right?
Right. Otherwise, like if it wasn't, why is it in the narrative? It just
Right.
seems so oddly just inserted. We're just gonna drop this, we're just gonna drop this reference right here. Because you can not have those first 11 verses and the story still works just fine. You don't even need it.
Right. All right. So we got the flood. Now the flood begins to subside.
Yep.
And so we're looking at Genesis 8 and 9. I'm gonna jump to the end of chapter 8. Let's say 8:15. God said to Noah, "Go out from the ark, you, your wife, your sons, and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that you have with you, birds, livestock, every animal that creeps on the earth, so that they can swarm on the earth, be fruitful, and multiply on the earth." And so here's the restart. So
Yep.
Noah becomes the new Adam,
Yep.
so to speak.
Yeah. No, we see a repeating of the same language to go out and be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah. So Noah becomes the new Adam.
Every beast, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that moves on the earth went out by families from the ark.
Yes. Yeah. And then Noah built an altar to the Lord, or to Adonai. Then he took from every clean animal
Here we go again.
and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. Adonai smelled the sweet aroma, and Adonai said in his heart, "I will never curse the ground because of humankind, since the imaginings of a person's heart are evil from his youth, nor will I ever again destroy all living things as I had done. So long as the earth exists, sowing time, harvest, cold, heat, summer, and winter, and day and night will not cease." So he kind of establishes seasons and changes And so it makes a covenant.
Yep. And then he hangs up that bow.
Yeah, makes the covenant.
Yep.
So the flood subsides. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." There it is again. Same language, right? The fear and the dread of you will be upon every wild animal, every bird in the air, every creature populating the ground, and all the fish in the sea. There's the fish in the sea.
There they are.
They have been handed over to you. Every moving thing that lives will be food for you. Just as I gave you green plants before, now I give you everything. That's interesting. I don't know if I've ever really paid attention to that.
Yeah. I mean,
so they were vegan or vegetarians or vegan, I don't know which one, in the garden, but now he says everything. You can eat everything.
Yeah. I've washed it all.
It's all clean. You can eat it all. Wow.
Yeah, but you shall not eat flesh with its life in it. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. For every beast I will require, and for man, from his fellow man, I will require a reckoning, life for life.
Right.
Yeah. So that's it. And then again, be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah.
And then God and then God takes that bow that he had, that he had used to inflict wrath, and he hangs it up upside down in the sky.
Right.
As a remembrance to him. Hey, I promised I would never do this thing.
I would never do this. Yeah, verse 12, God added, "Here is the sign of the covenant I am making between myself and you and every living creature with you for all generations to come. I am putting my rainbow in the cloud. It will be there as a sign of the covenant between myself and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant, which is between myself and you and every living creature of any kind. And the waters will never again become a flood to destroy all living beings."
Right. So it's for God's remembrance.
Yeah.
Not for ours. But then you've got to ask, is this just one of those, okay, well, why is there rainbows?
Right.
So they wrote a story. So they wrote a story.
Right. Or is it they needed to explain why there's rainbows?
Yeah.
Yeah, like you said.
Like with the, with the painful childbirth, with why do snakes slither, like
Yeah.
Like
yeah. And so I don't know if we want to get into the curse of Ham, because that's a whole deal.
That's a whole nother thing that can just go sideways. Because there's stuff there.
So we can hop forward to the descendants of Noah.
Well, I do want to point out though. I don't want to fully go into all that, because there's potential to be a lot of meat on that bone.
Yeah.
But let's just say, so this is Noah, who was the only one who God could find who was righteous in the land. And the first thing he does is he plants a vineyard, and he gets so drunk that whatever happens, happens. So,
and so what's interesting is, it's almost like history again repeats itself. That and that Noah finds himself naked and needing to be covered.
Yeah. Whoa.
Right? he finds himself naked and needing to be covered, just like
Yep.
Adam and Eve found themselves naked and needed to be covered. You know, but the controversy
Whatever else
comes in.
that means,
Right.
whatever else happens.
Right. But the controversy comes in what Ham does versus what the brothers do. They
Right.
cover him. Ham kind of exposes him.
Yeah.
And Noah curses Ham's descendants, not him, but his descendants.
Yep.
Which kind of leads us into Noah's descendants,
Yeah.
which is chapter 10. In chapter 10, there's a lot of meat there because basically this is affectionately called the Table of Nations, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so this breaks down all the nations, and there's a lot of argument in here with even if this genealogy is correct and what peoples came from where, and
Right, because we've got it's in Deuteronomy, right? There's a similar table of nations that we see in there, and that'd be interesting. I haven't done that before. That might be a study that I do today since I'm curious. But just comparing that table of nations to this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there are familiar names in here.
Very familiar, right?
Because these sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. The sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, were and we have Ashkenaz Jews today. Like that's
today, Ashkenazi, Ashkenaz,
yeah. So that's the thing. Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah, the sons of Javan, Elisha, Tarshish. That's a city that we hear about in the New Testament.
Yeah.
That Tarshish was all the way out in Spain.
Yeah.
Kittim, Dodanim, and from these, the coastland peoples spread their lands. So we've got that Tarshish, like I said, all the way out in Spain. So on the coast.
Right.
The sons of Ham, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. So, these are all the bad guys.
Yeah, the bad guys. Or at least what most would call the Gentiles nations.
Right. Yeah. Seba, Havilah, Sapta, Rama, Sabtika, Rama, Sheba, Dedan. Cush fathered Nimrod.
Yeah.
And he was the first on earth to be a mighty man.
Yeah.
Was he? I thought there was mighty men before.
Right, but not like him.
Now, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord.
That phrasing there, I did a study on that phrasing because there are some that argue that this is a negative, and then there's some that argue that no, this is a positive, to be a mighty hunter before the Lord. I don't know if you've done any research in looking at this, but Nimrod during this time, being one of the first great kings or great kingdoms, right? Great rulers on the earth, was a mighty hunter before the Lord. And that, when you look into the Hebrew, that before the Lord, that takes you into an entire study of, is this approved by the Lord? Is this just before the Lord? And so it's that whole conversation about Nimrod. Was he good? Was he evil? Was he just a person?
Right. I mean, why is it an insult?
Yeah.
Nimrod. I mean, why do we call people
Yeah, and later on in history, it takes on a whole different deal.
Yeah.
It goes
Yeah.
from it goes, it makes a different deal. So Nimrod, this mighty hunter, this mighty individual, later on is linked to Babylon.
Right. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Kalna in the land of Shinar.
Yeah, even
And
Nivea.
Yep. Yep.
He even built Nivea, and so I think that's where he gets his negative
Right.
perspective.
From the land, he went into Assyria and he built Nineveh.
Mm-hmm.
Egypt. Yeah.
So Egypt then followed. Yeah. So
Through some calcium, who it says from whom the Philistines come. So
right.
the Philistines come from Nimrod. So that's fascinating.
Fascinating, right?
These are the because these are the main enemies that God continually raises up against Israel anytime they turn away.
Right.
Because you look at Judges, and God will raise up this Philistine king, or this Canaanite, or this Amalekite.
Yeah. And you don't even get to the Israelite nations until you jump forward to the children who were also born to Shem.
Yeah.
So Shem seems to be the line where,
yep,
Israelites come from, specifically, Abraham.
Right. The Shemites, or
yes,
Semites.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Elan, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. Uz.
Mm-hmm.
So that comes in later.
Yep.
We see Sheila. We see Eber, and the name of Peleg. In his days, the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. I'm just kind of looking for some of the names that stick out a little bit more, because there's so many names here.
Yeah.
And they lived in the hill country of the east. And these are the sons of Shem by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. Well, hold up. There's no languages or nations yet. That hasn't happened yet.
Right.
So, I just point those little things out to prove this was all written later.
Yeah, and it was. And most scholars will tell you that the writer of this is looking back.
Yep.
They're not present, right? They're not this. They're looking back. Even in Genesis, where a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife.
Yeah.
There was, wife. Was that a thing then? Right.
Right.
So obviously this is something looking back. Not present at the time.
Because we see clean and unclean, which hadn't been established yet.
Right. Not in that time, right?
Right. Languages and nations.
Right.
Okay.
And then you get into
Tower of Babel.
Tower of Babel. Good morning, Epic.
Which apparently, Babel came from Nimrod.
Yep. Send it to Noah. Maybe I ought to put this back up here. All right.
Hey, there it is.
So this is Noah. So Tower of Babel. That's it. That's where we are here and now. All right. I don't need that.
Yep. Now the whole earth had one language. And used the same words. And as people migrated from the east they found a plain in the land of Shinar. Again,
Shinar.
so that goes back to Nimrod,
Right.
and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." How interesting that that's exactly what happens.
Yes.
No.
Yeah. Yes.
Right.
Brother Chalmers, how you doing this morning, sir? We got some people popping on. But go ahead.
Nice.
Go ahead.
Good morning. Let's see. Lest we be dispersed over the face of the earth, and the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people,
Mm.
and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, or Babel, because
Yeah.
the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of the earth. So, did this happen?
Or
Or
the
is this again just an origin story of why
origin
there's
story,
language?
yeah. Right. And how they all got dispersed into all these different places, because we have this table of nations in chapter 10, and then, well, how do these nations get spread out all over the place?
Right.
Right. And so there's a lot being, kind of, as you said, explained, so that we have an answer for why that happened.
Yeah.
And there's another thing that, because it's in Shinar, right? And will later be called Babel, Nimrod gets the nod for being the author of this, even though he's not mentioned here.
Right.
In this particular passage. It's really the nations and the people coming together. Nimrod's not like orchestrating this, but he kind of gets credit for doing this. And so now we get to come back and really break down Shem, the Semite.
So we'll do that. I forgot to do this earlier, so I'm going to throw this in here now. I'm going to go ahead and throw in the words of Andrew in here. We were talking a little bit about this the other night, because I was just thinking, so I was thinking first, because it's just a myth or a story, possibly about why there are languages, because I'm like, really, all they did was just build a tower, right? But today we're like splicing genes and we're doing all this scary stuff, but God's not doing anything. So this is where it started. So one, we're post-cross.
Right.
So even though our technology and our theology is different, the problem with Babel was that they weren't just building a tower; they built a tower to reach God.
Right.
But in doing so, they just repeated the sin of Adam and Eve again. But B, this violates the command to go forth and fill the earth.
Right. Nice. Okay, that's a good point.
To go forth and be fruitful and multiply, but instead they gathered.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. And then about the whole thing as a whole. So let's say myth and legend. We've thrown those words out a bunch. Does not mean we don't want anyone to hear that it isn't true.
Right.
Because mythos just means story, not that something is false. So if that's true, it can change the way we think about 1 to 11. So because every civilization on Earth had some type of Genesis 1 to 11 type mythology that really covers almost all these same topics. And all of them are nearly identical in form, with the exception to our Jewish myth, our Old Testament. The Jewish story provides an explanation for why all of civilization would share similar stories, but have different gods.
Yeah.
And Tolkien describes this effect best, and some things that should not have been forgotten were lost. History becomes legend, and legend became myth. So the important thing for how to look at Genesis 1 through 11 is not in the details of how things happened, but more so what it shows us about God and mankind. Genesis 1 through 11 shows us a creator God that creates without chaos, but order, that is able to control the chaos with just his voice rather than by might. A God that creates mankind in the Imago Dei, that gives tasks and purpose for man's benefit, not for personal power. One that is merciful, that even in judgment is faithful, that always is working for the reconciliation of all things to himself. So it doesn't matter if you read it literally or as a simple story. What matters is in the reading. We know God created everything by faith alone. That's Hebrews 11. So a literal creation story is obviously not the point, but God as creator is. So call it a myth if you want. Just don't miss what the story actually says. So that is Andrew's 2 cents, since he could not be here today.
Yeah. And I think, taking all those things into account, when you look at the New Testament writers, when they look back on this, and I mentioned this in one of our first streams on this particular topic, they viewed this as you said, true.
Yeah.
It's true. The details aren't necessarily specific or meant to be viewed as, okay, let's make sure this is meticulously, but the truth is what was being communicated, that God is the creator.
Yes.
Man sinned. Man needs a redeemer, right? Those things are the crux of what we are believing and teaching and sharing.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to be understood about, as you said, mankind and our tendencies, because seeing the patterns over and over again, just in these first 11 chapters.
Yep. It's the fall over and over and over and over and over again. Right?
Man keeps.
God says, go forth. And they say, let's gather and build a tower to God.
Right. Yeah.
So we're going to, build ourselves up to God, instead of, asking God to come down to us.
Or just
we're gonna do for ourselves,
right?
Rather than allowing God to do.
Instead of walking with God, and walking with God here seems to be, as I'm extrapolating from these chapters, walking with God is being obedient to him.
Right. Because Enoch walked with God and there was no more. And Noah walked with God and he was saved. Yep.
And so everybody who chose to do something different was no longer walking with God. And we found that those were the people that found judgment. They found, God. They raised God's ire, and it got received punishment for their actions. But those that walk with God were saved, and that's still true today. That's still true through the New Testament. That's still true, that walking with God, however he has revealed for us to walk with him, being obedient to that produces salvation. To neglect that. And so he says, be fruitful and multiply, and you do something different, you gather, you're not walking with God.
Right.
If God reveals that Jesus Christ is the way and you reject him, you're not walking with God. So God is the one who sets the parameters for what is righteous and unrighteous.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, we hit our 2-hour mark.
There you go.
And we are there at the Tower of Babel. That's Genesis 1 through 11. We basically started in 3. The first 3 weeks of this were 1 through 3.
Yeah.
But we wanted to dive into an overview. If you're listening and you have specific questions about certain aspects of this, and I'm gonna put my
anything from 1 through 11.
Yeah, we're gonna put this back up there on the screen. Is that as big as I can make it? Here, I can pull it forward a little bit. Oh, I don't like that. No, that one's good. We'll put us.
So all that, if you have questions about, any of that,
we would love to circle back and.
Yeah, because we're only at the 2-hour mark, which anymore, that's nothing but a thing.
So
2 hours ain't nothing these days.
So Epic says, I'm gonna put that up there. Let's show her comment. So Epic says, we still see that attempt to create and conglomerate of power. So man still creating and creating a conglomerate of power. So they're trying to do their own thing, build their own, and focus and rely on themselves more than God.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see, Tim, great point. Enoch didn't seek to build a tower to reach God, but simply walked with God. Absolutely. Right. Absolutely.
And so that's, that is the repeated theme here over and over again in 1 through 11. Before the narrative gets into, God's specific covenants with specific people, right? Starting with Abraham. But this is more of a generalized sense. And we see this over and over again. Man tries to meet God or be like God or what have you by their own terms.
Right.
Rather than how God has established. So, in the garden, it was, hey, just go live, walk with me in the garden.
Yeah.
But don't eat from that tree.
Yeah.
That's it. There was like one rule.
One rule.
Right?
Yeah.
The serpent said, hey, you eat this thing, you'll be like God. They're like, oh, okay, well, we like God. Let's do that. And then it instead of trusting in God and his plan, they took it upon themselves to be like God. We're kicked out. So for our protection, so that we don't live in that state of sin forever.
Right.
So we're cursed, but also protected from ourselves, from being immortal in sin. And then with Cain and Abel, of the first murder, and yet again, Cain is cursed with the mark, but this mark is actually a mark of protection so that others don't kill him. So we have God's mercy even in his judgment.
Yeah.
We have the line of Seth, Genesis 4, or so into Genesis 4, right, we're getting to Lamech. If Cain was cursed, let me be cursed. 7 times over. Then we get Genesis 6. Man was only evil all the time.
All the time. Every thought.
Every thought, right? Every thought was only evil continually, is how the text puts it. But Noah walked with God.
Right. Let's see. So Chalmer asks, what is Cain and Abel a foreshadow of? There's that is pregnant with foreshadowing. Jesus calls Abel a prophet. He said that they killed the prophets just like they killed Abel. And so Abel's existence was foreshadowing Jesus' sacrifice, that he was going to be that perfect sacrifice that was going to be acceptable to God. And so Abel sacrificing that, was the foreshadow of that. The rift within the Jewish nation, brother killing brother, that whole battle of brother killing brother, and also the younger rising above the older. That's actually a picture throughout Scripture. You see it with what's Joseph's sons?
Ephraim and Manasseh.
Ephraim and Manasseh, Jacob, and
Esau.
And ultimately Jesus and Adam.
Right.
So I mean, there's so much in there. There's a lot in there.
Yep. Jesus is the second Adam, but he was the chosen.
Right. So there's a lot in there. And then, like I said, in 1 John earlier, I talked about 1 John portrays Cain as the world and Abel as representing the righteous. Right. Mm-hmm. So there's just a lot. It is really, I think that's a great question. It is really pregnant with this foreshadowing.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully that helps, Chalmer. If you got a follow-up question, definitely put that in there. What else? We touched a little bit on Genesis 6 with man being evil constantly, always, right? We even touched on a little bit of the conversation of the Nephilim, the sons of God, daughters of men. There were giants on the earth at that time and after, when the sons of God and the daughters of men came together, and
whatever that means,
and they produced the mighty men of old.
Is it aliens? Is it angels? Is it other gods? Is it the line of Seth?
Right. And so we kind of touched on that.
The alien thing seems relevant right now, but
right. And then the fact that the Nephilim are present in the rest of the Bible narrative throughout the Old Testament, you have giants that are, and so it almost demystifies them. It takes away some of this, this came from the angel human union, if that's what we're saying it is, right? And somehow Nephilim or the blood of giants is in human DNA because you have giants throughout the Old Testament,
right? You
going
have
forward.
giants after.
So
yeah. So Noah's found righteous. He's conscripted by God to build the ark. So him and his sons' wives are saved, along with the beasts of the earth, clean and unclean, even though that hadn't been established yet. Then we get the lines of the kids. So the Hamites, the Shemites, the Japhethites. God says, "Go and fill the earth," and instead
they
they gather.
right.
So God said, "No." I said, "Go forth." Go.
Right. And it's interesting there, and this is another comparison, and this might be a stretch, but it's just something to think about. I'm not saying that this is or isn't. On the day of Pentecost, all the people gathered together, Holy Spirit was poured out, and it took the persecution of Saul to scatter the church to go out and preach the gospel everywhere. Otherwise, they were going to stay in Jerusalem. And so again, this idea that no, you're supposed to multiply, you're supposed to be fruitful, you're supposed to go out, because they're supposed to be, in Judea, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, even to the ends of the earth. Well, they were going to stay in Jerusalem, and it takes this persecution to cause them to scatter and go out, and the gospel be spread. So there's a lot of typology.
Not only that, you brought up Pentecost, but so what happened at Babel?
Right.
Language was created, right? So suddenly no one understood anyone else because we all spoke different languages.
Right.
And then Acts 2, the Holy Spirit comes,
right,
and everyone hears their own language.
Everybody can understand now.
Right. So suddenly we can all understand each other again because we have the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. There it is.
Yep.
Man. Yeah. And you guys, man, y'all jump in there because we're taking off. Yeah. So that's good. And so that's Genesis 1 through 11.
Yep.
Kind of an overview. We wanted
now,
to take this on.
Yeah. Did you want to? You said something about getting in and looking more specifically at the Shemites.
If we can, but I think if we do that, then we have to look at we end up having looking at all of them because because even the Cushites, right? Because the Cushites, Moses encounters the Cushites when he encounters Jethro, who's a priest of Midian, who's a Cushite, and Moses marries his daughter,
right?
And so there's a blend between Cush and Israel there. So that's interesting, which produced the Ethiopians, and we know the Ethiopians are one of the oldest,
basically the oldest, continuous church,
Judeo-Christian.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's interesting.
Because we have the Ethiopian eunuch as like one of the first Gentile converts in Acts.
Look at that, and there's just so many parallels. Yep. Yeah, just keep circling back.
Yep, and it does. Acts continues to do that. It basically follows the Table of Nations. We see the gospel go out and hit really each one of these areas and each one of these tribes.
Right.
Paul wrote in Romans that he wanted to get to Spain.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So he was trying to get out to those coastal peoples,
Yeah.
to those Japhethites.
Yeah. From Tarshish.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
All the way out in
And
Spain.
yeah, and so it's almost like there's a lot of these parallels and these restarts. You got Adam and Jesus, but yeah, the Tower of Babel and Acts chapter 2, and then the spreading out, the fruitful and multiply. Even the Great Commission is a spiritual
Be fruitful and
version
multiply.
of the natural, which was in Genesis, right? And so you see these parallels, and it's constantly showing up. But like we said, we've been saying for a couple of weeks, understanding Old Testament original context, then you can go into the typology, because I think it's Colossians 2:17 that says that all these things were a shadow of things to come, and Jesus is the substance, right?
Yes.
So everything was a shadow of him, and Jesus is the substance. Let's see, we got a comment here. Let's see if I can get this up here. Okay, what does the knowledge of good and evil mean, and will that knowledge be done away with in heaven? Interesting. You want to take that, or you want me?
Oh man. At least in the Genesis 2 context, God had established the rules. Our knowledge of what was good and what was evil came from dependency on God. We were never meant to be, or to have rather, our own moral agency, but instead be reliant on God. But now we all have our own version. There are the big things we mostly agree on that come from the Decalogue, but other than that, we've all got our own opinion on what good and evil is, because we've put it into our own hands rather than trusting God for what is good.
Right.
And will that knowledge be done away with in heaven? We'll be in the presence of all that is good, holy and righteous. I don't know. I don't think that the Bible is clear. It doesn't really say, and sometimes where the Bible's silent, we should be too.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the most you can glean from it is the knowledge of good and evil is an awareness of the consequences for actions, the fallenness of man. Because once man ate of the fruit, immediately they knew that they were naked, and they felt like they needed to cover. Which before that, it was that there was nothing like that. It was, everything was good. There was no bad. There was no, oh, that's wrong. Even though God gave this command, they knew it. Well, God said this. There wasn't necessarily, well, it's wrong to disobey God. Right? They didn't necessarily have that, but they knew God said. And so, this is what God said. This is what we should do. But once they ate of the fruit, it was like, whoa, we messed up. Cover up, shame, guilt, all those things. So the knowledge of good and evil is seemingly this awareness of consequences to actions, that there are things that, this is bad, not just this is, and so, and again, like I said, there's nothing clear. Right? I wish the Bible would just say clearly, this is what it is. I think it's a great question, but I think it almost becomes a philosophical question.
Right. And will it be done away with in heaven? In a experiential way,
Yeah.
sure.
Yes.
In an empirical way, sure. Because you know, we're going to be there's no evil in heaven.
Right.
So there will be nothing for us to look at, view, and observe and say, hey, look at that evil thing. I don't think we're going to be concerned with evil at all
Right.
in the presence of God. I don't think it's gonna be the furthest thing from our mind.
Yeah.
What evil is.
Just as Adam and Eve, there was
Right.
no thought of that. And so, yeah, I was sharing with somebody that the other day that when that comes around, there's not going to be any thought of good, evil. There's just going to be God and
Yeah.
our existence with Him. And I even gave the analogy of the animals no longer wanting to tear us apart. Yeah. The lion and the lamb shall lay down together, right? Which is a beautiful picture of this ferocious animal with this very defenseless, timid animal, and they lay down together. So yeah, I think in heaven, like you said, yeah, there will be no need for this particular knowledge of evil type thing, because you'll know everything, so you won't need to know. You'll know everything that you need to know. So okay, that back up there. All right, well, we probably could keep going, but I feel like we can land this plane. Is any final thoughts that you want to throw out there, Matt, before we wrap this one up? And if you guys have further questions, something that you want to elaborate on that we can pull and bring back in for our next stream, please throw those out there.
Just to, be open and be willing to read it, for the story that it is. And, see these little points. Okay, well, maybe this is just, it's an origin for this thing, and it's an origin for this thing, and don't get lost in the details. So often, in the fight for inerrancy and the Bible being true and God's words and all of that, we get lost in the details. We lose sight of the forest through the trees. And you need to have that forest view.
Yeah.
And really, I think the takeaway from today, Genesis 1-11, is just go walk with God, y'all.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, yeah, I'd agree with that, and I would say understand that, especially as you're reading the Old Testament, that you need the full picture to understand some of these nuances, because there's some things that the Old Testament is setting the groundwork for that the New Testament will fill in the missing components. You say, well, why is it telling me this? Here's why. Right? Why is this being shared? Because there's a much bigger story that is being told. And if you start this movie and you stop halfway through, you never get the full understanding, because there's a lot of things that are going to be explained in the second half, that were just laid out in the first half, right?
Yeah.
Genesis 1-11 lays a lot of the foundational work for things that are going to be, as we showed you guys,
for names and places that
names
come up an awful lot later.
awful lot later, concepts that are going to come up later. information of like, oh, that's where that came from. That's why that is. Yeah. And so, yeah, make sure you read with the idea and the understanding that there is a full picture and that Old Testament, New Testament, they're not complete without each other. Yep. They're not complete without each other. If you read through the Old Testament, yeah, be faithful, read through it, but know that there's some things that you're not going to understand till you get into the New Testament and then say, that's why.
Yep.
So
the New Testament fulfills the Old, and then the New Testament also, it shines light back on too.
Yes.
So we can see what was being foreshadowed and what it all ultimately truly meant in its truest sense. Because that's the other thing too, with the Old Testament especially, there's often a meaning for that time and place.
Right.
It's a thing that happened
there.
But in the scheme of God, it's also pointing to this eventuality of the cross.
And that's that duality that you find in Scripture, that there's a meaning specifically there, but there's also a future or more extensive meaning, because the Bible in itself is a prophetic book. And that's kind of what prophecy is that it has a meaning, but there's also something unfolding, awesome. Well, for you folks that have been rocking with us for 2.5 hours, want to thank you for hanging out. Hopefully you got something. Remember, send us, email us, message us any further questions that you would like to have us explore, and we will explore them. Again, Scripture is the ultimate authority. Be a Berean. Go back to the Word, read it for yourself, check it out. And if you come up with things that, hey, I want a more understanding of that, please do that. Otherwise, I guess I in the words of Joe Day, you are prayed for and you are loved.
Yeah.
Definitely. And Matt, would you like to say a word of prayer to close us out?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Lord God, thank you for your word, and that sometimes it isn't written clearly, and that we have to dig and we have to find that relationship in you through your text. If it was clear, Lord, we would read it and we would put it on our shelf and we would pull it out for reference just like any other book. But instead, it is written in types and in shadows and in dualities in a way that we get to wrestle with the text. And you really force us to continue to uncover more about who you are. So thank you, Lord, for your intentionality in the way that the scriptures are written. Thank you for this time and place, for the technology that allows us to have these talks and reach the people that we reach, and be with us and in us in our lives, and help us to be people who walk with you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Amen. Well, God bless you all for rocking with us. We will see you next week. God bless.